In 1992, the critically and commercially successful sci-fi series Alien received its third entry, aptly named Alien 3. It proved to be a similar success to the first two entries financially, but critically, it wasn't as well received. And this was understandable when considering just how troubled its production was. It went through a couple directors and several writers before finally becoming the film we know today. Despite the slightly below average reception to Alien 3, it was still successful enough to warrant a sequel. And 5 years later, in 1997, this sequel would release, entitled Alien Resurrection. Likely recognizing just how much studio interference hampered the third entry, and being impressed with his previous work, writer Joss Whedon was largely given free rein over Resurrection. Joss Whedon clearly has a very different style than what was typical for the Alien series at the time, and considering Ripley's death at the end of the last movie, it was clear that the Alien series was moving in a new direction. The last time there was a large shift in this series, it ended up working out, and after the lackluster reception to Alien 3, it might have been just what this series needed to get back on its feet. However, initially, the reception to Alien Resurrection appeared to be much the same as Alien 3. It did similar numbers commercially, and critically, it was widely regarded as either mediocre or just plain bad. How does Alien Resurrection hold up today though? Even if it wasn't a return to form for the series, is it at the very least a step up from Alien 3? As was previously mentioned, Joss Whedon wrote the screenplay for Alien Resurrection. Initially, Fox had envisioned the protagonist of the story as being a clone of Newt from Aliens. Abandoning Ripley as the series protagonist was an idea that came up ever since Aliens, and with her death in Alien 3, now seemed to be the perfect time. After Whedon had already gotten 30 pages into a film treatment though, Fox apparently changed their minds. They suddenly decided to shift the focus to a clone of Ripley instead. Interestingly, this whole clone idea actually came from producers David Giler and Walter Hill, who apparently opposed the production of Alien Resurrection from the beginning. With this idea to bring Ripley back, obviously Sigourney Weaver would have to be convinced to return once again, which had been difficult for each of these sequels. Although initially apprehensive, Weaver did like Whedon's script and was eventually convinced to return as Ripley. She stated her reason for returning was because she found the concept of Ripley being part human and part alien interesting, and she said some stuff about wanting to explore the character further through this lens. But let's be entirely honest here. The $11 million paycheck definitely didn't hurt. That being said, Weaver didn't just phone in this performance, and she ended up being the best part of the movie by far. I mentioned earlier how Joss Whedon's style is very different from what was typical for the Alien franchise. He tends to be a more comedy-focused writer, but he has been known for his ability to write strong female characters as well, so he's not the worst choice for an Alien film. Now before we go any further, I feel it's important to note that Joss Whedon has been cancelled in the past few years for several cases of misconduct and generally unprofessional behavior. I'm only mentioning this to say that these allegations would not play any role in my critique of this movie and the script in particular. Generally, I do believe in separating the art from the artist. With all that being said, yeah, this script sucks. Almost all of the characters are either simplistic or unlikable, or in most cases, both. The plot is very straightforward, with events moving from point A to point B with little to no points of interest in between. And all attempts at humor fall completely flat, of which there are plenty, as Alien Resurrection is more of a dark comedy than a horror movie. Supporting this vision of making a dark comedy was director Jean-Pierre Jeunet. Well, actually speaking of allegations, initially Bryan Singer was asked to direct Resurrection. Fortunately, he decided to do X-Men instead. Either way, Jean-Pierre Jeunet was soon attached to the project, which was especially interesting since he says he thought a sequel to Alien 3 was a bad idea. So just to reiterate where this production's at right now, the director doesn't want to make this movie, the producers don't want to make this movie, and the lead actor didn't want to be in this movie. Clearly this was shaping up to be a disaster, but production continued. Now, even though the story didn't have much promise, if there was one thing all the Alien movies had in common up to this point, it was that they all looked good. Alien Resurrection would break this streak though. This movie looks disgusting. That's honestly the best word to describe it. Some movies can pull off that grimy look well, like Seven for example, where the filth and stench of the city can be sensed through the screen. In that film, it serves a narrative purpose and supports the themes of that story. In Alien Resurrection though, it's just plain ugly. The whole film is coated in these repulsive yellows, browns, and greens. Considering the more lighthearted nature of this story relative to the rest of the series, and the many comedic elements, this aesthetic clashes with the events taking place, the performances, and the dialogue. Even if the footage wasn't dipped in urine after filming, it still wouldn't be very appealing though, as what was actually captured by the cameras isn't pleasant to look at either. The costume design is comically bad in Alien Resurrection, and I don't hear anyone talking about it. What is Ripley even supposed to be wearing? Matter of fact, what are any of these characters wearing? Well, except for Travis Bickle over here, I don't mind his design as much. The ugliest element of the film by far though is the newborn. although I think that was the idea. It was meant to be utterly repulsive, yet there's a very human element in its eyes. Looking at it fills the viewer with a mix of disgust and just the slightest sense of compassion. It's odd, and while I commonly see people hating on this design, I grew to appreciate it eventually. And the effect was accomplished almost entirely with animatronics, which I can appreciate. That's not to say no VFX were used in Alien Resurrection though. In fact, VFX actually were used on the newborn for specific shots in order to remove genitalia that had apparently been put on the initial design. After realizing in post that this was idiotic, it was removed. Infamously, VFX were also used in the opening scene of the special edition. While the special edition for Alien Resurrection doesn't make as many alterations as Alien's Extended Edition or Alien 3's Assembly Cut, there are still some notable additions here. Firstly, it has an entirely new opening sequence, which is significantly worse than the one featured in the theatrical cut. I can respect the concept of beginning the film zoomed in on an insect's mouth which resembles a xenomorph, but in execution, this is just flat out embarrassing. The CG looks unfinished, and the gross out humor immediately following this moment does help set the tone for Alien Resurrection, but unfortunately, that tone isn't appealing in the first place. In fact, it's so bad that even the title card feels unearned in this moment. On the other hand, the theatrical release places the title card and opening credits over shots of grotesque anatomy. This highlights the use of body horror throughout this narrative and foreshadows the failed clones. Both openings then go into the clone reveal, and they each feature that excellent opening line that calls back to this moment from Aliens.
My mommy always said there were no monsters, no real ones, but there are.
This time though, who exactly the word monsters refers to is left somewhat ambiguous. Admittedly, it could still refer to the xenomorphs, but it could also refer to this clone of Ripley being a monster, or a construct as Call puts it. There's also a third meaning, which is probably the most likely, where the word monster refers to the scientist who violated the laws of nature and brought back both Ripley and the xenomorphs. This quote from Newt being said in Ripley's voice also makes both Ripley's regression into a somewhat childlike state clear, and it establishes that she still has some memories from her previous life. That aspect of the line only really pays off in the special edition though, where we get a couple more scenes that reference Newt further. And these actually ended up being my favorite bits of the narrative. These moments were likely cut out of the original release so that Alien Resurrection could stand on its own, which I can understand since the Newt callbacks don't really end up paying off in any substantial way. But still, I did appreciate their inclusion. Ripley being unable to fully remember Newt, yet still crying when reminded of her, was a tragic moment that really established just how unethical this whole thing is. It also reminds the audience of the true cause of all the tragedy in this franchise. It creates a through line between all the death of this series and Ripley's unnatural rebirth. That through line being corporate greed, which was the cause that both began and continued the events of the Alien saga. The best scene in the movie also comes as a result of the special edition, and that's Ripley and Call's conversation in the chapel. This scene is present in the theatrical release, but it's unfortunately cut short. The special edition has Ripley reference how she once tried to help a little girl who suffered from bad dreams, and yet now she can't even remember her name. And I want to make one thing clear right now. I absolutely hate Alien Resurrection. I hate everything it attempts, and frankly I find it almost completely unwatchable. But man, this is a really good line. Probably one of my favorites in the series. This one line is what really made it finally hit home that Newt was gone. And not only that, but Ripley wasn't even granted the mercy of dying along with her, as Alien 3 had so poetically set up with the furnace. All in all, I found Alien Resurrection to be genuinely horrendous. By far the worst entry in the original quadrilogy. I understand that the disgust the film elicits in the audience is largely intentional. I just don't think it works with the other things the story was attempting. If it was a pure horror film, it could work, but the dark comedy and action elements distract from it and just make the whole thing feel disastrously confused. And despite how varied Resurrection is tonally, it still ends up being profoundly boring. If I did have to give it a few more compliments though, I will say that the scene with the failed clones was pretty good, the behind the back basketball shot was impressive, and the ending could have led to something interesting if it was ever followed up on. Unfortunately, that fifth entry never did end up happening though. At one point a screenplay was being worked on by James Cameron, yet all future plans were cancelled once the Predator crossover was announced. And after its release, Cameron ruled out any future involvement with the series. It's unfortunate this retrospective ended on a down note though, especially since I really did enjoy the first two films. Maybe someday I'll come back to cover the Predator movies and those crossovers, but that probably won't happen anytime soon. Either way, I'm glad I got a chance to take a look at some films that inadvertently shaped my childhood through their influence in some of my favorite franchises. With the Alien retrospective over though, what's next? Well, reviewing Alien 3 made me curious about some of David Fincher's earlier work. So for the month of November, we'll be taking a look at a few of David Fincher's films from earlier in his career, starting with the movie that was mentioned earlier in this video, Seven. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.